Good evening and welcome to our Fourscore Speaker Series. Tonight, we are excited to have author Ted McClelland with us to discuss his latest book, Course of the Union, How Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas Set Aside Their Rivalry to Save the Nation. His book is a timely exploration of Abraham Lincoln's long rivalry and eventual alliance with Stephen Douglas. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'm the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation is the only national foundation focused on increasing access to history, educational programs, exhibits, and sites highlighting the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. We do our work in cooperation and partnership with others locally, nationally, and globally. Our vision is for a world where freedom and democracy flourish, inspired by the life and work of Abraham Lincoln. For more information on how you can support this mission, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd just like to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as possible. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Fourscore Speaker Series program. We're delighted to welcome Edward Robert Ted McClelland to the program to discuss his newest book, Course of the Union, How Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas Set Aside Their Rivalry to Save the Nation. The book was published just this past June by Pegasus Books, which noted that by focusing on the importance of Illinois to Lincoln's political development, this book, quote, challenges the notion that he was an indispensable great man. Lincoln was the right person to lead the country through the Civil War, but he became president because he was from the right place. Living in Illinois provided Lincoln the opportunity to confront Douglas over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The debates with Douglas during the 1858 Senate campaign brought him the fame and prestige to contend for the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. His moderate views on slavery, which he developed in the swing region of the swing state, made him the ideal candidate for an election that had sweeping historical consequences, end quote. Ted is a native of Lansing, Michigan, which is also the birthplace of Burt Reynolds and the Oldsmobile. After getting his start in journalism at the Lansing Community College Lookout, Ted went on to work for the Chicago Reader, where he met Barack Obama during his failed 2000 campaign for Congress. His coverage of that race became the basis of Young Mr. Obama, Chicago and the Making of a Black President. His other book, The Third Coast, Sailors, Strippers, Fishermen, Folk Singers, Long-Haired Ojibwe Painters, and God Save the Queen Monarchists of the Great Lakes, a travelogue of a 10,000-mile journey around the lakes, won the 2008 Great Lakes Book Award in general nonfiction. Other books by Ted include Nothing But Blue Skies, A Cultural History of the Rust Belt, and Midnight in Vehicle City, about the pivotal Flint sit-down strike of 1936. His work has appeared in the Chicago Reader, the Chicago Tribune, Salon, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And he lives here in Chicago. Ted, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So to kick things off, Ted, can you tell us about your career path? What inspired you to become a writer and specifically to write nonfiction?
Well, let's see. Well, I guess you could say I got my start in journalism. You know, I worked for a newspaper. You kind of get instant gratification working for a newspaper. You write something and there it is the next day. Today you write something and there it is today. So I did that. As you said, I worked at the Chicago Reader when I first moved to Chicago. My goal was to write for the Reader, and I worked my way into a job there, and that's where I met Barack Obama at the low point of his career. But the last two books I've written have been history books, and you know, I kind of feel like it's a better fit for later in your career than journalism. I didn't want to write any more journalistic books. I wanted to write history books. So we'll see where else this takes me.
Excellent. Well, most, if not all of your books focus on Midwest or Midwest rooted topics, and this book certainly fits that given its Midwest subjects. But I have to wonder, what prompted you to write this book on Lincoln and Douglas, and why now?
Well, I don't know if you remember in 2021, Douglas was suddenly, or maybe in 2020, Douglas was suddenly being canceled all over Illinois. They took down his statue from in front of the state capitol, and they took down some honors to him at the at the University of Chicago. And so I kind of started looking more into his record, because he's usually kind of remembered as the bad guy in the Lincoln Douglas debates, the guy who was on the wrong side of history. And I found out that he was on the wrong side of the history until he wasn't, until he was on the right side of history. That he was a unionist, and he was a patriot, and he wanted to win the Civil War for the Union just as much as Lincoln did. And I actually wrote an article that appeared in the Washington Post, and it was on January 6th of 2021, about the importance of being a good loser in a presidential election. And that was sort of the germ of this book.
Well, I really enjoyed reading this book, and for all of you listening, if you haven't picked it up yet, I encourage you to do so, and we'll be dropping that link in the chat. At the beginning of your book, Ted, you address how Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas were peers in a sense early on, but that
Right.
in the years after that, in no small part tied to the fate of their political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, Douglas had long since outstripped Lincoln in terms of political recognition, power, and influence by the time of 1854 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which really sort of spurred Lincoln back into politics. Can you talk about that dynamic between them and how that began to change?
Yeah, well, they were young, young men in Springfield at the same time in the 1840s, and they would get together in the back room of Joshua Speed's store and argue about politics around the stove. And they had a little thing where I think they went to a few county seats. I think it was in 1840, and debated the issues of the day. And those were actually the first Lincoln Douglas debates that we don't hear too much about. But Illinois at that time was a Democratic state, always voted Democratic for president. Douglas was a Democrat. So it was a lot easier for him to move up the political ladder. He was Secretary of State, he was on the Supreme Court, he was in Congress, and he was in the Senate. And the best Lincoln could do was one term in Congress from the Whig seat in central Illinois. And Lincoln was actually pretty envious of Douglas. I think he said something like, his name is known all over the country, and even in other lands. My compared to him, my life has just been a flat failure. And he stands astride the world, and I just sort of look between his legs.
Which was a great comment given their height differential too,
Yeah,
just the idea
exactly.
that. So
exactly.
you point out in your book that the Lincoln Douglas debates, or the Douglas Lincoln debates as they were known maybe at the time, changed this dynamic quite a bit, and that the Freeport and Quincy debates are notably consequential in terms of their future presidential campaigns, and not just in hindsight, but that people understood that then too. It's argued that Freeport cost Lincoln or Douglas the presidency. Quincy helped Lincoln's rise to it. Can you talk about how their dynamic and the relationship evolved over the course of the debates?
Well, I mean, the debates made Lincoln a national figure. They were reprinted in the in New York City, and Lincoln gained. Douglas was the most famous politician of the era, probably maybe after the president, or maybe even more famous than the president. And so Lincoln gained so much by appearing on the same stage as Douglas. It gave him a stature he'd never had in his life before. And you talk about the Freeport debate. That was when Lincoln sort of maneuvered Douglas into his Freeport doctrine, in which he said that even if you open up the territories to slavery, if the residents of the territories didn't pass police regulations to protect slavery, then the right would be no good at all.
Yeah.
So he was kind of going back on the consequences of the Dred Scott decision in that case.
So, given how those debates went for Douglas, and how his staking out popular sovereignty and the statements that forced him to make about Dred Scott, why did he dig his heels in further to the point where, as you point out in the book, he made some unprecedented moves, like publishing a 19-page essay on popular sovereignty in Harper's,
Right.
or his decision later to campaign on his own behalf for the presidency? Why did he do those things in the wake of that and of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and what were the consequences?
Well, he actually wrote that. Yeah, he wrote that essay after the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and it wasn't very well received. He was trying to put himself on the side of popular sovereignty and claim that the American Revolution had been all about popular sovereignty, and he was sort of reading history backwards.
Which Lincoln called him out on, did he not?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. When they were both speaking together, when they were both campaigning in Ohio a year after the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the state elections in Ohio, representing their parties. And as far as, campaigning for himself, I mean, he was really in a tough spot by 1860. I mean, there were four candidates in the race, and it looked as though he was going to finish. There's a good chance he was going to finish in fourth place. If there had been a contingent election in the House, he wouldn't even have qualified. And a lot of people thought it was just beneath the office of the presidency, but at the same time, they didn't think it was beneath Douglas because his ambition was well known. It was well known that he would have done anything to become president.
So we often hear about the trouble Douglas faced with Republicans on the one side and the fire eater Democrats on the other side. And President Buchanan is often remembered for being weak and ineffectual. But as you go into in this book, Buchananites were not shy about going after Stephen Douglas and trying to undermine him. Can you talk about what was behind that dynamic and how that played out, even specifically in the Ohio campaign?
Yeah, well, Buchanan is sort of, this was, I think, the controversy over the Compton Constitution in Kansas. Buchanan was for it. Douglas was against it. He didn't think it represented the will of the people of Kansas. And he was removing some of Douglas's patronage appointees, which was the source of a lot of Douglas's power in Illinois. And there was even a faction that they called the Danites of candidates that were supported by the administration in those 1858 Senate elections. They had their own candidate.
I'd like to steer us to the tale of two conventions, and you go through this in the book too. There's, on the one hand, the disastrous Democratic conventions featuring seceding delegates, and Douglas, who 2 years earlier, you could say, was the presumptive Democratic nominee for the next presidential race, and he failed to secure a unified nomination as the party splintered into three different parts. And on the other hand, you have Lincoln, everyone's second choice at the Republican convention, winning that nomination through various maneuvers. Douglas is fighting a civil war within his own party that's only getting worse. And I thought about this in reading your book because secession has been threatened many times in American history. But when the general public thinks of secession in the 1860s and the immediate pre-war, they think about actions taken after Lincoln's already elected to the presidency. But your book spends a good bit of time on the calls for secession that happened even before that, such as at the Democratic National Conventions, plural. So they're openly calling for secession, not just because of Lincoln, but because of people in their own party, like Stephen Douglas, who they think aren't sufficiently pro-slavery. How did that experience, first of all, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that in general. And then also, how did that experience influence Douglas's view of states seceding at the outbreak of the Civil War? What did he learn from his convention experience that he applied or didn't apply to this situation once we were actually on the brink of civil war as a nation?
Well, the Southern delegates wanted a federal slave code. and they were going to walk out unless they got one. And Douglas knew that if he campaigned, if he had to campaign on a platform of the federal slave code, he would not win any northern states. And so there were, you know, all the delegates from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, walked out of the convention. And, you know, even at that time, you needed two-thirds of the delegates to get the nomination of the Democratic Party. And I think that was to ensure that the slave states could veto any potential Democratic candidate. So the convention in Charleston simply failed to nominate a candidate, and they had to reconvene 6 weeks later in Baltimore, where they nominated Douglas. And I think that really, you know, brought home to him how intransigent the Southerners were.
Well, and to a large extent, he clearly understood, as did others in similar positions to him that had maybe more connections or experience with elected officials and people in the Southern states in general. He knew that the threat of secession was more real, perhaps, than Abraham Lincoln. But on the flip side, he operated after the election as though some sort of compromise was possible. Was that wishful thinking on his part?
I think so. I think he really did think he could convince the masses of the South that secession was not in their best interests. I think he had that high opinion of his own abilities as an orator. But I think it was, but I think the Republicans were thinking even more wishfully, because most of them didn't believe that the South was going to secede at all. You know, Douglas had been through this convention; he'd seen them walk out. He knew that they would walk out of the Union just as easily as they'd walked out of that convention.
I thought it was fascinating how your book also goes into Douglas's relationship with both the future president and vice president of the Confederacy, Jeff Davis and Alexander Stephens. He had very different relationships with these two. Can you share more about that, and also his reveal in Atlanta with Alexander Stephens right there with him?
Well, Jefferson Davis hated Stephen Douglas.
To put it mildly.
Right. He thought he talked out of both sides of his mouth. He thought he took whatever the most expedient position was. So they didn't get along at all. But yeah, Alexander Stephens was one of Douglas's biggest Southern supporters. I think Alexander Stephens, although he later became vice president of the Confederacy, I think he wanted to preserve the Union right up until the last. And he appeared with Douglas and endorsed Douglas. And Douglas did not have much support in the South. You know, he took that big tour of the South the week before the 2 weeks before the campaign, you know, even though he had no chance to win any of those Southern states. But he believed that, you know, he by that point had stopped campaigning for himself and started campaigning against secession and in favor of the acceptance of Abraham Lincoln as president.
Well, and you go into those actions that Douglas took, because he was in the South. He was in, I think, Alabama, if I'm correct. Stephen Douglas was, when the results of the election were made clear. And in the immediate wake of that, he attempts to quell secessionist passions and encourage faith in the system of self-government. Even pointing out that while Lincoln, a Republican, had been elected to the president, he didn't control the Senate or the House. He was seeing signs. He was seeing signs, to your point, even in the Deep South, that many people still favored Union. You describe a scene where he's speaking to a group, and someone in the crowd unfurls a banner that says Douglas 1864. you know,
Right, yeah, that was,
suggesting, yeah, that they were looking ahead. So he was seeing
right.
those signs. How much, I mean, I guess, can you speak a little bit to what he was seeing and how that then changed? And also, I'm curious, in your research, how aware was Lincoln of those efforts and the need for those efforts at that point?
It's hard to say what Lincoln was aware of because he didn't make any public statements
Yeah.
during the campaign. You know, you never hear him say good for Douglas. He's out there stumping for unionism. But yeah, that Douglas 1864, that was in New Orleans right after the election ended. And of course, Douglas didn't live long enough to run another campaign. So I think, I have some instance where, Lincoln was having dinner with a journalist and he said, oh, those states will never succeed. People in Virginia will be lined up all the way to the North Pole to get federal jobs. And I don't know if the Republicans really were unaware of how the South felt because, the Republicans were a Northern party. There were no Republicans in the South. Or if they simply didn't want to admit that electing a Republican would lead to the breakup of the Union.
In terms of compromise, well, in terms of the campaigns and compromise too, John Crittenden, Henry Clay's former right-hand man, figures at several pivotal points in your book.
Right.
And was known to both Lincoln and Douglas. Douglas was one of the senators put on a committee to consider the Crittenden Compromise package, and he endorsed it. Douglas endorsed the Crittenden Compromise.
Right.
So here you have a fractured party that's lost and hopes to preserve the Union, but also regain through compromise what they'd lost, or else they would secede. So when that failed, Douglas made his own attempt that included his favorite doctrine of popular sovereignty. And then you have the peace conference, which you also go into in your book, but you refer to it, and I thought it was interesting that you referred to it this way because some of these compromise packages read as sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't ultimatum being made to the party, Lincoln, that won the presidency. But in your book, you refer to the so-called peace conference as a trick to deliver an ultimatum to free states that would lead to nothing but anarchy. Can you talk about why you phrased it like that? What did you mean by that?
Did I say that, or was I quoting somebody?
It didn't have quotes around it, is my recollection. But
okay.
You might have been quoting someone. But in any case, whether they're your words or a quote, can you explain what's meant by that?
Well, they wanted, protection for the southern states of the peace conference wanted protection for slavery in the territories. And, Lincoln's position was, we ran a campaign, the basic tenet of the Republican Party is that we're not going to have extension of slavery outside the states where it currently exists. We'll tolerate it where it exists, but we won't allow it to expand. And so he gave really specific instructions to his allies to stand firm against anything that would weaken the position the Republicans had taken on expansion of slavery.
Lincoln and Douglas didn't come face to face again until February 23rd, 1861, when Lincoln received the Illinois delegation in Washington, D.C. This is when he's arrived before his inauguration. Can you share some insights into what you believe allowed Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas to put aside their deeply rooted political and personal differences to work together for the Union?
Well, it was secession. It was Fort Sumter. It was the Civil War. Douglas was just as much of a Unionist as Lincoln was. And you know, I think they had differing opinions on how to prevent a war from starting, but I think they were both on the same page as far as prosecuting the war and winning the war for the Union. I mean, Douglas went to the White House and participated in um, military strategy with Lincoln.
As you mentioned, Douglas went on the road for Union, so to speak. He made several speeches, and his final speech was in Chicago in May of 1861. It was his last
Right.
public effort to rally support for the Union. And shortly after that, he fell ill and died.
Right.
And you also note in the book that Douglas went from being burned in effigy in Chicago
Right.
for the Kansas-Nebraska Act to, on that visit, receiving a huge ovation as a
Right.
defender of the Union. So
Yeah.
that's part of that redemption arc that you talk about.
I thought the even more important speech was one he gave in Springfield. The one that
The
became
month
known
prior.
as the protect the flag speech. And I mean, I can quote from it. I mean, I think that was his. What do I say? What do I say about it here? That was
The one after the attack on Fort Sumter on April 25th.
right. Right. Considering the moment, the sentiments, and the years of discord between Douglas and the man to whom he pledged his loyalty, it may be regarded as the greatest argument any politician has ever delivered on setting aside partisanship in a time of national crisis. I said, you all know that I'm a very good partisan fighter in partisan times, and I trust that you will find me equally as good a patriot when the country is in danger. He said, do not allow the mortification growing out of defeat in a partisan struggle and the elevation of a party to power that we firmly believe to be dangerous to the country. Do not let that convert you from patriots to traitors in your own land. The greater the unanimity, the less blood will be shed. The more prompt and energetic the movement and the more imposing the numbers, the shorter will be the struggle.
What was the immediate impact of that speech? How did people respond to it?
Well, I think it had a lot to do with building support for the union among Northern Democrats. I think Douglas had a lot to do with that. And there were people who were skeptical of fighting a war for Lincoln, fighting a war for what they thought was to defeat slavery. So I think somebody said that and people were one reason he gave the speech was that there were worries about the loyalty of Southern Illinois, which is, you know, very Southern in its character and the ancestry of its people. But Southern Illinois took the side of the Union. There were 4,000 federal troops in Cairo.
How did your reading of that speech affect your view of Stephen Douglas when you were writing this book?
Well, you know, I think that I think he's sort of been an unfairly maligned historical figure. I think he's remembered as an antagonist to Lincoln, and I don't think that the story of how he and Lincoln came to be allies is well known, or has really been told before, and that's one of the big reasons that I wrote the book.
how did Douglas's commitment to union and the ability to differentiate that between full-throated support of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, but the support of union, how did his commitment to the union cause impact Northern morale at that time?
Well, let's see. I think I was looking at another quote about that in there. This was from Gustav Corner, who had been a lieutenant governor of Illinois. Douglas's influence was of large advantage to our cause, as he was really the idol of the Northern democracy. The counter efforts that were made for some time by John A. Logan and Dan Voorhees, who denounced Douglas as having betrayed his party, fell dead, and Logan soon found it advisable, in order not to kill himself forever, to join the volunteer army.
Yeah. During the Civil War, prominent former presidents like Franklin Pierce and John Tyler offered sympathy to the Confederacy. At a time when public opinion was just so sharply divided, Douglas really stood out as an active defender of the Union. We just talked about how it boosted his pro-union stance, boosted Northern morale. What was the backlash for Douglas's pro-union stance? Not only, I mean, did it lead to some "I told you so's" from the fire eaters? Did it also win him enemies that he didn't have before in the North?
Well, his family owned a plantation in Mississippi, and he wrote there asking his overseer for money, and he said, "I'm sorry, this is a foreign country now," and some people wanted to sell Douglas's plantation and use the proceeds to fund the Confederate Army.
The relationship between Douglas and Lincoln is often cited as an example of both a political rivalry and, is in your book, political unity in a polarized nation. It could be seen also on the flip side of that as maybe a cautionary tale of too little too late. But given today's political climate, what lessons do you think modern leaders could draw from both the Lincoln-Douglas rivalry and their collaboration for the Union?
Well, I think as Douglas said, be a partisan fighter in partisan times, but in a time of national crisis, put party away, put country over party. Once he said we must. Oh, he ran into a here he is. He ran into the clerk of the House of Representatives on Pennsylvania Avenue. He said, and he asked Douglas, "What is now to be done, my dear friend? What are we to do? We must fight for our country and forget all differences. There can be but two parties, the parties of patriots or traitors. We belong to the first."
Powerful words. We have some questions from the audience that I'm going to work in now. And folks in the audience, please feel free to add more questions as we go. So Dr. J has asked, and I'm not, so the question is, why do you think Douglas thought Lincoln was such a poor dictator?
Was such a what?
A poor dictator.
A poor dictator?
Yeah.
I
Perhaps,
don't know.
Dr. J, you might need to clarify, perhaps, I mean, maybe it's I don't know if it's a comment on.
I don't know that he thought he was
oratory
dictating.
Or, yeah. Maybe it's meant like it's his oratorical skill or something.
Well, he respected Lincoln's oratorical skills. He said he was the strongest man in the party. He was the best speaker that they had. He said he was going to have his hands full with Lincoln when they nominated him for the Senate.
So the next question comes from Stephen Schneider, and he asks, in your research for the book, did you learn much about U.S. Congressman and Senator William A. Richardson, Stephen Douglas's political lieutenant from Quincy, Illinois?
Yeah, he was Douglas's floor leader at the convention. And I think he was elected to Congress in in 1860. I think I have something he wrote to Douglas here. Yeah. After the election, he wrote to Douglas, "We are beaten but not conquered."
That's one of the things you go into in the book as well, is sort of the political machine that Stephen Douglas had in place that Lincoln
Right.
did not have in place at the time. Even to the point where, that includes both the pomp and circumstance, but also given his position of political power, he had people throughout the state who were part of his political machine. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, he used patronage to build his power in Illinois. I mean, the postmasters, the inspectors, medical officers, they were approved and appointed by Douglas. So I mean, he sort of invented the Illinois Democratic political machine. He was the first one, which we still have, or we had until recently today.
Yeah. And one of the factors you touch on the book several different times is the importance of location. So that comes into play both with where Douglas was, because he accepted Lincoln's challenge to debate him, but then he picked sort of the terms, the places they were going to go. And he was very strategic in those choices. Not that it ultimately helped him in the long run, but can you talk a bit about why Douglas chose the cities and towns that he did in the sequence that he did?
Well, there was supposed to be one for every congressional district, and they had already both spoken in Chicago and Springfield, so those were left out. So Illinois had 9 congressional districts at the time, so that left 7, and so he chose a prominent city in each of those districts. And they're all really small towns. Some of them may even have over 40,000 people even today. It's the biggest thing that ever happened in every one of those places.
Yeah, many of them within the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area too. Some of our friends and partners within the National Park Service. And you also, and folks in our audience might be aware of this, but you describe how the state itself, being a swing state, but also being a place where citizens from other parts of the country were settling. And so you describe how that makeup of the state also influences the politics of those regions.
It was a microcosm of the nation. The northern part of the state was settled by people from New England, and the middle part of the state by people from places like Pennsylvania and Indiana, and the southern part by Kentuckians and Tennesseans. So you had views on slavery throughout Illinois that mirrored those throughout the country. The North was very anti-slavery, the South was very pro-slavery, and in the middle, they didn't seem to want either the slave power or the abolitionists to get too much power. That's where Lincoln was located. So he had to balance. He had to balance those interests. He learned to do that in central Illinois.
You also talk about how both candidates, to some extent, but Douglas, used it in some of his offensive attacks on Lincoln during debates, accused the other of being two-faced or tailoring their message to the audience. One of the things that made the Lincoln-Douglas debates different, and you alluded to this earlier, and this is referenced in your book, is the fact that while these debates were very local and sometimes being performed in front of small towns, though drawing sizable audiences from different parts of the state, one of the differentiating factors of these debates and the consequences it had for Lincoln and Douglas was the fact that they got national coverage. Can you talk about why those debates for a Senate campaign for Illinois were drawing such national interest from the media, from journalists?
I mean, I think it's just what we just said was that Illinois was a microcosm of the nation. I think someone said that Illinois is the Union for all intents and purposes during this Senate campaign. I think people
How
People
much of
thought-
it was Douglas's,
people thought that as went Illinois, so would go the nation.
to some extent, Douglas didn't have much to gain from debating Lincoln, though, as much as Lincoln had stood to gain from
Right.
debating Douglas. Is that right? Is that fair?
Right. But Douglas didn't want to look like he was dodging Lincoln, or he didn't want to look like he was playing the coward by refusing to debate Lincoln.
Yeah.
So they played on his pride to get him on the debate stage.
Which was better than following him around the
Right.
state, which Lincoln had
Which is
been doing
what-
prior to that.
Right, which is what Lincoln had been doing before, and the Republican State Committee thought it made him look ridiculous.
So we have another question from the audience. This comes from Jeffrey Boutwell, and he says that Ted mentioned Lincoln wanting no compromises at the Virginia Peace Conference held at the Willard Hotel in February 1861. One of the famous phrases from that conference was Massachusetts delegate George Boutwell, who helped write the Republican Party platform for the 1860 election, telling John Tyler, James Sudden, and the other Southern delegates, quote, "The North will never consent to the separation of the states. If the South persists on the course which she has entered, we shall march our armies to the Gulf of Mexico, or you will march yours to the Great Lakes. There could be no peaceful separation." What's your reaction to that, Ted?
It sounds like something somebody from Massachusetts would say at that time. You know, that was, you know, I know Douglas considered Henry Wilson, the senator from Massachusetts, as a member of the Republican War Party. I don't think I have that quote in my book. I looked up Mr. Boutwell. He's mentioned a couple times, but I don't think I have that quote in there. Let me see if I have anything. It does sound like a familiar quote, though. Yeah, okay. Let's see. Well, I just have Virginia's James Seddon told Massachusetts Governor Thomas Boutwell, "We must have new lands." And Boutwell did not agree.
Do you think that disagreement from New England states in particular, but also Republican? I mean, there were some Republican delegates to these conventions that even Seward himself was in favor of trying to find a compromise. But once he accepted the role of Secretary of State, he had to speak on behalf of the administration to an extent.
Right.
How much of that kind of reaction from the North was, you know, just seen as respecting the process and the voters who had cast their ballots, and how much of it do you think was this sort of lack of understanding for how serious some of the Southern delegates were about secession?
I don't think, I think even at that point, they didn't think the South was going to secede. Yeah, I think their attitude was, we won the election and we wanted campaigning on this issue, and you know, we're gonna stick to it, and we have the voters on our side, and you're gonna have to live with it.
During his final days, there's a very the way you describe Douglas's last days, in particular after he's fallen ill, and how just, you know, it was daily news updating the public on his condition as it was
Right.
failing, and he was being asked for his if he had any final words for his sons or for his mother or for his sister, and among his final words are, I think you said, were ultimately what were written on his sarcophagus.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking for them. You might have them handy, but can you share what his final words were?
Yeah, that should be on the.
Oh, I found it. So his final words when he was asked if there was anything that he wanted to have passed along to his sons who were at school in Georgetown in DC, or his wife or sister, and it was his wife Adele asking his mother, her sister, his wife Adele asking this, and among his final words were the response: "Tell them, quote, tell them to obey the laws and support the Constitution of the United States." Those were reportedly his final words to his family, but also in a way to his nation. What was the impact of those words on that time? Clearly they were reported. We know of them. They were written on his sarcophagus. He was given a very public funeral. How much did that influence his how he was viewed in public memory in the immediate term?
Well, let's see. So, on the day after his death, Secretary of War Simon Cameron ordered all regimental colors draped in mourning and issued a proclamation to be read to the troops, calling Douglas a man who nobly discarded party for country, and his death a national calamity. And even when he was on his sickbed, he was getting letters from Democrats saying, "Well, why are you supporting Lincoln? What's going on? Or have you gone over to the Republican Party?" And he responded, we should never forget that a man cannot be a true Democrat unless he is a loyal patriot."
We have a question from Melvin Cunningham, and he asks, didn't the Civil War start April 12th, 1861?
Yes.
And with the firing on Fort Sumter.
Right.
And Douglas had given us, if that's in reference to his Springfield speech, that was April 25th, 1861, a couple weeks
ago. Right. Yeah. So he went back to Illinois very soon after the Civil War started. Because the governor had called a special session of the legislature for the purpose of raising a militia to defend the Union. And it was thought that Douglas's presence would especially bring Southern Illinois into the fold.
In researching this book, Ted, what's the most surprising thing you learned, or surprising anecdote that you found in your research for this book?
I remember Lincoln saying something like he didn't need to bring his wife everywhere to make sure he didn't get drunk.
That's a memorable one, yes, because Adele did accompany Stephen Douglas
right
around for all of his.
She would. I think Mary only went to the last debate in Alton. But
one of the things that stood out to me in your book, and I feel like I'd seen this referenced before, but it became that much more stark thinking about it in the context of the presidential campaigning, was when when Stephen Douglas attended a clam bake and referred to it as a peculiar institution, and then compared it to how all states have their peculiar institutions, like some of the southern states have with slavery. And I thought that had to be it. Yeah, it felt like an odd joke that he would make that comparison to peculiar.
I think that later on there was some reference to clams when he went to Virginia, and he said I think he said he liked clams more than Negroes. Where was that? That was in Rhode Island. I have more fondness for your clams. So there's a charm about this beautiful day of life in this sea air, and something in that particular institution, in that peculiar institution, It makes me think you can afford to bargain with our Southern friends. That if they will let you alone, you will let them alone. I have more fondness for your clams than I have for their Negroes. So let every man do his taste, and if they prefer them, we must respect them.
Yeah, such a bizarre
Yeah.
comparison for Douglas to make.
Well, he never been to a clam bake.
Yeah, still
And
sort of.
he said he was eager to experience one of the peculiar institutions of Rhode Island. Every state had its own peculiar institution, and ought to respect the others.
Yeah. Very, very interesting comments for him to be making.
Right.
So several of your other books deal with history and political history. Is there, you've written about now two presidents from Illinois.
Yeah. Yeah.
What,
That's true.
what are some of the lessons that between the two of them, the book that you wrote on President Obama and this one about President Lincoln and his rivalry and relationship with Stephen Douglas, are there any particular lessons from the two of those books together that you've taken about politics in Illinois over a considerable period of time?
Well, Illinois, Illinois was the right place to produce the first Black president, I think. Illinois had more people don't realize this. Illinois had more Black congressmen than any other state, more Black senators, I think, than any other state. Had 3 so far now. I think more Black statewide elected officials than any other state, every office except the governor. So, just as Illinois was the right place to produce the man who ended slavery. I think that somebody made a comment during the Obama's first Senate campaign that Illinois was once again the location for a shift in racial attitudes. So Illinois has sort of been a center or an engine of the nation's racial progress. I guess we can say that.
On the national scale in particular.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So you've turned some of your attention to history. What are your next projects in the works? Do you already have a book project underway? Are you working on some?
No, I don't really have another one going on right now.
Do you have ideas about what your next project might be that you're willing to preview for us?
Well, let's see. I wrote a book called How to Speak Midwestern, and my agent wants me to do it for the whole country. So about regional sayings and regional accents. So that's a possibility. I thought about writing something about Lincoln's boyhood too.
Well, and that would be fascinating. We've done some or are doing some partner work with Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial in Indiana,
Indiana,
and the birthplace site in Kentucky, in addition to our friends at Lincoln Home.
Yeah, I don't think it's well known. I don't think people know that Lincoln had a sister who died in childbirth. The whole part of his life before he arrived in Illinois.
Well, and sometimes there are, I'm appreciative that we have birthplace and childhood sites that are saved, because I think, to your point on how our environments shape us, who hasn't formed some part of their personality or moral compass because of where they came from? And you even go into that with this book about, Douglas was not born in Illinois, neither was Lincoln, but both of them were able to realize their career and their political aspirations in the state, but they still took part of who they were from where they were born and from where they spent their boyhood too.
I think Douglas said Vermont was a great place to grow up as long as you left.
And if I remember correctly in your book, didn't he say that in Vermont to a Vermont audience?
Well, he had said it before, and he said something. He sort of amplified it. What did he say? Because he went back to when he was campaigning for president. He went back to his hometown of Brandon, Vermont, which I actually visited when I was researching the book. They have a Douglas, Stephen Douglas Birthplace Museum there. So in some ways, he's more honored in Vermont than he is in Illinois. There's still a statue of Douglas inside the state capitol. But they took down the one outside the capitol. What did he say? Yeah. So I once remarked half in jest that Vermont was a good state to be born in, provided you emigrate when young. So I say now, Vermont is a glorious place to be born and to educate and train your children. Here you inculcate virtue. You train them in the habits of industry. You teach them the necessity of labor.
I wonder how the audience received that. I mean, on the one hand, it's a very powerful and positive sentiment, but there's an
Right.
underlying, and then you leave Vermont message, which might not have gone over well. But as you point out in the book, it's a mostly Republican audience he's speaking to anyway. So it's not as
Right.
if it's not as if he's
Right.
winning any votes.
No, he lost his hometown. He lost Vermont, his home state. And then he said emigration was what cemented the Union. In Illinois, Douglas had mingled with the best bloods of New England, New York, Kentucky, Virginia, and South Carolina, whose features were all blended in a single generation. He said, one thing is certain, you will have to go to Illinois for your next president. Illinois is rich in corn and commercial wealth and rich in candidates for the presidency.
And that was an incredibly, incredibly prescient statement. It was true, regardless of whether or not Douglas or Lincoln was going to win the presidency. Well, Ted,
Right.
thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for writing this book.
Thank you for all
It is
your
a
questions.
wonderful book. Yeah.
Thank you for all your questions and for reading the book so closely. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Here's the
My
cover.
pleasure. Yep.
All right, you got it.
Excellent.
Mine's backwards.
I think mine looked backwards to me too, so maybe that's just
okay.
each of us
Yours
on
look the right way to me.
Thanks again, Ted. We look forward to seeing what you publish next.
Okay.
And thank you all for joining this evening. And Phyllis, I'm turning it back over to you.
All right. Yes. Thank you again, Ted, for joining us tonight to discuss your book, Chorus of the Union, How Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas Set Aside the Rivalry to Save the Nation. I know everyone had a great time this evening hearing from you. Next up, join us on Wednesday, December 4th, for a great conversation with author Megan Gorman on her book, All the President's Money. This is a relatively new listing, so if you haven't already made plans to join us, please check it out on our website and register today. We have a full calendar of Foursquare programming available this year, and we hope that you will visit our website and register for them all. We look forward to seeing you. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, we thank you in advance for taking a moment to complete the survey. As always, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all in December. Good night.